Hello students, this is module 5.5.2. This is going to be about the general features of Kingdom Plantae and specifically about one group called the Bryophytes. So we'll probably label this module Bryophytes. So if we look at the features of Kingdom Plantae, this is for the whole kingdom, we can look at features such as the fact that plants are multicellular, eukaryotic photoautotrophs. So they're made of more than one cell. These cells have nuclei and membrane-bound organelles, and these organisms derive their nutrition through photosynthesis. And here we can see capturing the sun's energy is how plants make their living. I love that photograph. Okay, or that video clip, I should say. The second feature is that plants have cell walls of cellulose. You've known this since almost the second week of the class, so you shouldn't forget it now. You should remember it. Plants also have chlorophyll A and B, and here's a little chromatograph similar to the one that you may have made for thin layer chromatography, our photosynthesis lab. A fourth feature, plants show alternation of generations, and you just learned this, and you should practice this and apply this. A fifth feature is some plants have organs, and the numbers of types of organs that plants have are quite limited. They can have roots, stems, leaves, and flowers. Now, to a botanist, these have to have a specific structure to be considered true roots, true stems, and true leaves. Even though a plant may have a root-like or stem-like structure, it may not be considered a true root or stem by a botanist. In any case, another feature is that there are four groups, four phyla of plants, and fortunately, just as in the fungi, the suffixes of the plant phyla have been standardized. They all end with ophyta, and ophyta means plants, and so it's actually very, very nice. So let's look at these four phyla, or the four groups of plants. We're going to consider in this particular module Bryophyta, phylum Bryophyta, I should say. These are the non-vascular plants. They include mosses, which most people have heard of, and liverworts, which few people have heard of. These plants reproduce with spores, not with flowers and seeds. The second phylum is phylum Pterophyta. You will note that the P is silent. These are the seedless vascular plants and includes the ferns and some fern relatives. These also reproduce with spores. A third phylum that we're going to learn, and there are a number of other phyla here, is phylum Coniferophyta. These are the conifers. They belong to a larger grouping called gymnosperms, and gymnosperms includes some other phyla, as I say, that we're not going to be learning here. We're going to learn phylum Coniferophyta as a representative of the gymnosperms. And the word gymnosperm actually means naked seeds, and the seeds of these plants are typically produced on cones where they are on scales of the cones, and they're not really covered, and so they're considered naked seeds. The fourth phylum is phylum Anthophyta. Anthophyta means flowering plants, and they belong to a group called the angiosperms that only has one phylum, phylum Anthophyta. So the two terms, Anthophyta and angiosperms, are used somewhat synonymously. But these are plants that have flowers, and the flowers give rise to fruits that cover seeds. So they have seeds that are covered with fruits. Together, number 3 and 4, these make up the seed plants, as you'll notice that both of them reproduce with seeds. And if we looked at a family tree of plants, a cladogram, if you will, it looks something like this. And here we can see the different phylum names tumbling down. If we look down here at the base of the cladogram, where it says origin of plants, that of course would be a chlorophyta, or a green algae ancestor, and it gave rise to the plants. And surviving from fairly far back in plant evolution are the bryophytes, and these are the non-vascular land plants. And then vascular tissues evolved, and the other three groups of plants all have vascular tissues. Remember, they consist of xylem and phloem. And we have the seedless vascular plants, which are in phylum Pterophyta, the ferns, And then we had the evolution of seeds. And so there are two groups of plants which are seed plants, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. The gymnosperms include a number of phyla. We're going to learn phylum Coniferophyta, the conifers, the cone-bearing plants, as a representative of the gymnosperms. And then we had the evolution of flowers and fruits. These are only found in one phylum, the Anthophyta. And so that kind of gives you an overview of plant evolution. You will recall that we did learn about alternation of generations, and I want to tell you with this slide how the stages of alternation of generations, its stages in plant life cycle, vary with the different groups of plants. Remember, they all have the stages, but they vary in their dominance. And so in ancestral plants, the gametophyte dominated, and in more advanced groups, the sporophyte predominates. So if the gametophyte was dominant, here you can see this tan right here. This figure is using the term importance, the gametophyte's importance or the gametophyte's dominance. And when we say dominance, we mean that how large and how long-lived it is. And so for mosses, the long-lived portion of the life cycle is the gametophyte. For more advanced plant groups, like in the conifers of the gymnosperms and the Anthophyta of the flowering plants, when you look at a pine tree, when you look at an oak tree, or if you look at a strawberry plant or a grass, any of the flowering plants, what you're looking at is a sporophyte. And the gametophytes are greatly reduced in these last two groups. They are microscopic. The male gametophyte of a pine tree or of a flowering plant is just the pollen grain. The female gametophyte is just a few cells in an immature seed. And so it kind of gives you an idea. And these guys are, gametophytes are completely parasitic upon the sporophyte, which is to say they're not photosynthetic, they don't make their own nutrients, they depend on the sporophyte. And we have just the opposite arrangement when we consider the bryophytes. The gametophyte is the dominant stage, and the sporophyte is parasitic upon it. So with that, we are ready to look at our first phylum of plants. We're going to look at phylum Bryophyta. The common name of that phylum is the non-vascular plants. This includes plants such as mosses and liverworts. And here you can see this is a carpet of moss. So we're looking at gametophytes here when we look at this. So let's look at some of the features of phylum Bryophyta. These are small plants that grow in moist places on land. They lack vascular tissue, hence the common name for the phylum, the non-vascular plants. This is the only phylum of plants that's currently in existence that has no xylem or phloem. These plants do require freestanding water for the male sperm to swim through in order to reproduce. These plants have a cuticle, although it's fairly poorly developed. These plants lack any of the true plant organs. They don't have true leaves, they don't have true stems, they don't have true roots, and of course they don't have flowers or fruits. And in the life cycle of these plants, the bryophytes, and we'll look at it in more detail in a moment, the gametophyte is dominant and the sporophyte is dependent or parasitic upon the photosynthetic gametophyte. So this actually shows the gametophyte, and the sporophyte grows out of the top, and we'll learn about this. We are going to call this the capsule, the sporophyte. There's more terminology, but that's sufficient for our purposes. We can look at some pictures of bryophytes. These are small plants that are at the most inches tall, and some of them are very flat. Here's a bunch of a carpet of moss over rocks along a stream and a waterfall. There's another moss, Randy moss, and yet another moss, Kate moss. Okay, these last mosses probably don't belong in the plant kingdom, but nevertheless, when you hear the word moss, you might think of them. So those are mosses. Here are what liverworts look like. They're flat and they have many lobes, just like a liver has many lobes. And we'll talk about how they got their name a little bit later. Mosses are fairly common in Cochise County, liverworts not as much. I've seen mosses many times, and I don't think I've ever seen liverworts, and that doesn't mean they don't exist. I haven't gone out on an expedition looking for them, but nevertheless, if they're here, they're at higher elevation, moisture places. Whoops. Here is the alternation of generations in the bryophyte life cycle. Now, you can orient yourself in this life cycle by looking at the line of ploidy. Right here, you can see diploid is kind of has a, I'm not sure what color that is, kind of a greenish background, and haploid has kind of a tannish background. And we can start with the first cell of the haploid gametophyte generation, which is a spore produced by meiosis. And here's the spore. It germinates and it grows by mitosis into a multicellular gametophyte. In this case, in mosses, typically we have separate male and female gametophytes. The shorter gametophyte belongs to the female, and the taller one belongs to the male. We'll see why that is in a moment. At the very tip top of the gametophytes is where the gametes are produced, again by mitosis. The female eggs, which is the female gametophyte, is produced in a vase-like structure, and the males are gametophytes are produced in a bag. Now, the male gametophyte is a flagellated or tailed sperm that has to swim, so it needs water. Now, you might think that this might mean it's somewhat aquatic, but that's not the case at all. It requires just a small amount of water, and there might be enough water in condensation or in dew or in rain. In this case, it shows raindrops splashing the sperms from the taller male gametophyte to the shorter female gametophyte. And so the difference in heights facilitates that exchange. And also, if this area should become inundated because of rain, then the male sperm could swim into the shorter female plant. Regardless, what does happen is that in the female structure, on the tip of the female gametophyte, a male sperm will fuse with the egg, and this fusion is fertilization, and thereby the line of ploidy is crossed, and the first cell of the diploid sporophyte generation is produced. That's called the zygote. And the zygote grows right from the top of the female gametophyte, and so the sporophyte is produced on top of the female gametophyte. And that's what is shown kind of here in the center, where it shows the green part below and the capsule above. The capsule here in orange is completely parasitic and gets all of its nutrients from the photosynthetic gametophyte. Now, within the capsule, there are special cells that undergo the process of meiosis and produce spores. And thus we go all the way around the life cycle of the bryophytes. Now, this particular unit is all about names and features. So we've been talking about features of the bryophyte, so you have to know that name. But we also want you to know a representative genus. And the genus is the genus of the moss called peat moss. And the genus is Sphagnum, Sphagnum. The common name is peat moss. So when you see the letter CN, it usually means common name here. And peat moss grows in bogs, and bogs cover about 1% of the land area of the earth. These are very moist and very acidic areas where this peat moss grows. And as it continues to grow, we have partially decomposed sphagnum that forms peat. And if it was more thoroughly compressed over, it had much more pressure and more time, it would form a type of coal. But peat itself is used as a fuel for cogeneration plants. In Ireland and other places, they cut little strips of peat and let it dry for several weeks, and then they burn it in an electrical cogeneration plant that they use it to produce steam, and that turns a steam turbine, makes electricity. They also used peat moss in the past in bandages because the peat moss has special cells that are absorptive. Today, I have some peat moss in my shed, and it's used for soil amendments in the yard, and so it puts organic material that holds water and has nutrients into the soils to make the soils better. So when we say we're amending the soil or using a soil amendment, it means we're usually putting in some organic material. A real interesting thing is the discovery of bog mummies. It turns out that these bogs in historical times in different cultures were used as places of internment for dead bodies, and because of the high acidity of the bogs, it actually inhibited decomposition. And so some of these bodies are very well preserved. Now, in different cultures, in different times, this was a place of honor, or it was a place where criminals were put. But here's the bog mummies. Aren't they interesting? Really is quite fascinating. And before we close this particular module, I do want to explain where the liverworts of phylum Bryophyta get their common name. And this is from a concept called the doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures, well, let's just start off by saying that wort, W-O-R-T, is an archaic name for a plant, not to be confused with the word W-A-R-T, a wart, which is caused by a virus on the skin. And the doctrine of signatures is an incorrect concept that a deity made plants to resemble human organs that would benefit from treatment by those plants. For example, if you consider liverworts, it was thought that a plant extract or medicine made from liverwort would help liver problems. And because of the resemblance of a liver. And this is, by the way, on the upper left here, is a liver of a vertebrate, but not of a human. This is a rabbit liver, I believe. And it's just showing the lobe structure of the liver and the lobe structure of the liverwort. This definitely doesn't work. There's no effective or efficacious drugs or chemicals in the liverwort that help liver disease. So it doesn't work for healthcare, but it does help to understand, explain, and remember some plant names. So with that, we'll close this module.